Hi, I'm Shah, and I am a software engineer at Kapwing.
And I'm Cameron. I am also a software engineer at Kapwing.
And today we're going to answer the internet's most searched questions about startups. Let's get started. Are you excited, Cameron?
I am very excited.
Okay, first question. Are startups worth it?
My answer is a bit boring. I would say startups are worth it for some people and in some situations, but not worth it.
My answer is yes, it's worth it. But yeah, it depends. Depends what you like. Are startups dying? I think startups individually are dying. Like certain startups are always dying or growing. Some are dying, but I would say generally the idea of startups never die because startups are just basically ventures, and the idea of ventures never die. What do you think?
I would echo exactly that.
Okay, so let's go. Next one. Are startups good to work for? I'm going to say yes. I would say startups are very good to work for. Obviously, it depends on the startup. If you think of a startup as a smaller group of people, it's very easy to kind of influence the culture and have impact. So I generally like those things. So I personally think they're good to work for.
I think so too. I think if you're looking for freedom and impact and certain kinds of learning opportunities, then startups are absolutely perfect for you. But if you're the type of person that requires safety and some other things that big companies might be better for, then maybe they're not good for you.
Yeah, if you want to click a button and have someone bring you a brand new desk, it's not good for startups. Are startups, I got this one, don't worry guys. Are startups a fad? They've gotten very, very popular in the last couple of years, but I think there's a good reason for that. Just the accessibility to create a technology startup has just been lowered a lot. So it's a good reason why people have just been creating more startups. So I take that as a plus. If we want to call it a fad, sure.
Any time that like the barrier to entry is lowered for opportunities to make money, then there's always going to be some wave of people that are only doing it for that reason. And I guess you can say that startups, because the barrier to entry has been lowered a bit for certain kinds of technology startups, then that is true. But I think startups will always be around.
Are startups designed to grow fast? It depends on who you talk to. I know a lot of people who just say the definition of a startup is something that's designed to grow. I personally don't believe that's the case. I think a startup is any group of people, usually in a small quantity, who are driven to do something they want to do. And that's kind of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe modern startups are designed and encouraged to grow fast, but every small business could probably be considered a startup, and there are a lot of them that don't grow, period.
Yeah, it definitely colloquially people love to call startups like these fast growing things.
Yeah.
And that's just a general idea, but I think it's broader than that. Next one, are startups profitable? That's an interesting question. I think the traditional startup tends not to be profitable for the sole reason of if you're profitable, it implies that you have extra money and that money can be used for growth somehow. So I don't think a lot of startups tend to be profitable until there's a big push. But I don't think there's anything wrong with being people treat a profitable startup as this sin, but profit is great.
I would say that for many cases, the whether or not a startup is profitable is inversely correlated with how fast they're growing, probably, because usually startups that are growing really fast tend to be spending a lot of money.
Okay, are startups SMEs? What does that mean to you?
Small, medium enterprises.
You go first.
I would say a startup is what TechCrunch calls it. So I would say for most startups probably, but I'm sure there are some startups that are bigger than a medium-sized company. So
yeah, I mean, startups is a huge umbrella term, which quite frankly, the bounds are unclear. So I mean, if you consider a non-public company to be a startup like Airbnb, I guess that's an enterprise. And then our company is a startup too, and we're 12 people. So yes, 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 and yes to all those things. Small, medium, and enterprise. Are startups successful? Some are.
hopefully ours is.
Yeah. It depends on your definition of success. A lot of startups become publicly traded companies. A lot of startups fizzle out. A lot of startups don't even launch, and quite frankly, depends to me a lot. All of those are successful to a degree. I've been at startups that have not, quote unquote, been successful, but I was grateful to have those experiences. I learned a lot. But yeah, I'm sure it would have been greater if we just made millions of dollars too. That's a separate conversation.
And I would also say that the word success, depends on what the founders intended for the company. But you could also maybe generalize the question to are like businesses successful? Mm-hmm. So for a business to be successful, does it need to make enough money to pay its employees and stuff like that?
And if the question is, are startups the generic term successful? I would say yes. They employ a lot of people, and I mean, if you just think about the market cap of some of these companies, it's just made America the greatest place ever. Okay, next one. Are startups, and again, there are startups everywhere, just clarifying. Are startups overvalued? This is a contentious topic.
I don't know how to answer this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can give a great answer, because I mean, we're just two guys in a room. But there is a somewhat of a belief that people are just, investors specifically, are just paying way too much for startups, and there is some truth to that, I think. I mean, businesses and entrepreneurs are just these unique ideas, and quite frankly, people are just kind of gunning for the next big thing, so they're willing to overvalue it a little bit, and they've been kind of right in the last 10-15 years, but there's a belief that we're going to run out of luck, or it's just not possible to have this much success.
Yeah, I think the question depends on whether or not you value potential in a problem space. Because the startup itself might be overvalued, but the potential for the startup might not be, and it might not have many competitors, so it might soon be valued at what people are paying for it.
Take everything we say with a massive grain of salt. Are startups overrated? Startups are totally overrated. No, they're definitely not overrated. I know they're very popular, and it's become, I remember graduating and everyone told me, like, oh, you gotta go work for a big company, you gotta get your MBA and be a manager. And like in the last 5 years, it's just become so much more popular to kind of work at a startup. So it's definitely become more popular, but I still don't think it's overrated. And the reason is I've worked for, I would say, 2 large companies and 2 startups, and I learned more. And I learned more at the 2 startups than I did at the 2 large companies.
Yeah, I think, again, overrated depends on what you're looking for. If you're the type that would work at a big company like Facebook or Google, and you see a bunch of flashy stuff on someone's newsfeed about the startup that they're working at, and you're like, oh, that looks cool or whatever, maybe I should do that. Then maybe it might be overrated for you because you're the type that works at a big company, but you're just evaluating the glamorous parts of working at a startup. But if you really value the freedom that you get at a startup, and you really value a lot of the things that startups are really good for that Shaw highlighted, then it makes a lot of sense, and they're definitely not overrated.
Cool. Next one.
Okay, the first question. How do startups work? You can start with that one.
How do startups work? Very broadly, a group of people decide they have a mission and they ask for money. Sometimes they don't ask for money, and sometimes we give them money and they make a product. Sometimes they charge for it. That's kind of it.
Yeah.
And then you just kind of build what you want to build. And if you are right, you make more money and you bring value to the world.
Yeah. I'd say imagine that you're working on like a project at a hackathon with a couple friends, and then make that hackathon span a few weeks, and then start like getting other people and start looking for money, and then that's kind of what it feels like.
Yeah.
Except you don't work crazy hours like a hackathon.
You don't have to get the money. You could do anything you want.
How do startups make money?
How do startups make money? That is an excellent question. I mean, the most traditional way is a startup makes a product or service, and then they charge people for it, and then they make money. Obviously, another way they quote-unquote make money or get money is from investors. But there's, I guess, lots of ways. I mean, if you make an investing startup, it can just get money through returns, really anything. Anything that you can charge for or get money from is possible.
My answer would be Stripe. How do startups give equity?
How do startups give equity? Literally, or just like amounts? Literally, they fill out a cap table, they provision it to investors, founders, people who work there, really anyone as long as they write in a contract. How they decide that? A lot of different ways.
Yeah, I think startups allocate a certain amount of equity that they're gonna give to existing employees and future employees, and then they spread it across based on the distribution that you want for different types of employees, and then that equity will vest. Like I think there's a 1-year cliff for most startups. So after your first year, that's when your first round of equity vests, and then every quarter after that, you'll get a little bit more equity. How do startups get funding?
They ask people for money and they get it. That's really it.
How
I mean, obviously it's like a hard thing to do to convince someone to give you money, but traditionally you ask some entity for money, be it a venture capitalist, some incubator, friends and family.
How do startups pay employees with the money they get?
Via
from
paycheck.
funding.
Yeah, I mean, it's the question is how they pay them. It's like literally through some payment system.
Yeah. Which is probably not Stripe.
Yeah. If it's how
Unless-
well they pay them,
unless
depends
you
on the
put it.
startup. All right, next question.
How do startups hire?
Like most other companies, depending on your size, they will sometimes hire the people they've worked with in the past, create recruiting efforts. I mean, even here we've done events where we've gone to boot camps, looked for friends, opened accounts on Lever, AngelList, really everything. Okay, next one. There you go.
All right. How do startups get money? Isn't that
the same one? Is it here and here? Well, the generic get money is either through revenue, funding, and I guess if people just hand it to them, they find it on the street, anything. Yeah. All right, next one.
ads?
Oh, ads.
How do startups spend their money? Oh, that's
Depends.
Also
Yeah, depends on the
contentious
startup. There's a belief that a lot of startups spend way too much money on advertising, CAC, which is the cost of acquiring customers. But really, it's anything. Like snacks is a big one. But if you spend too much on snacks, it's pretty bad. But primarily, it's paying your employees. If you have a good service that you're selling, paying for those basically cost of goods sold. And then if you have advertising, really anything a small business or any business would spend money on. But hopefully not at the scale of a large business. Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, I would say anything that helps the business is what the startup spends money on, right? And it could be something really weird. It could be something like paying your employees. How do startups scale?
I think fundamentally a technology startup is by definition already scaling. By that I mean if you're solving a problem through technology, by definition you're not manually solving that problem. If you think of some sort of, let's think of something like Salesforce. The reason it's a technology startup and the reason it's doing well is that you have a SaaS platform that anyone can use, and the marginal cost per new user is relatively low, and that's, I think, the definition of scale. But if this really meant how to start up scale as in grow, just hire more people and then optimize your platform, things like that.
Yeah, I feel like a startup is like a step function where every step is just like the next. So like a startup in the very beginning is solving probably some small problem that can turn into a bigger problem. And then as the startup grows, they reach the next step. They hire a couple of people, the problem expands a little bit, and then the number of features expand a little bit if you're a technology product, and then it just keeps going up and up and up, hopefully. How do startups advertise?
How do startups advertise?
Facebook.
Facebook ads, definitely. Google ads. Depends on your size. A lot of startups in San Francisco will buy billboards. If
We
you're
had a
really
hiring
big.
ad too on Facebook.
Oh, Facebook ads. Yeah, we have
And that
hiring
works
ads.
too.
Recruiting ads, yeah, that's good.
Recruiting
Yeah.
ads are fun.
All those things. Cool. Next one. Check it. Woo!
Oh.
You came back. Do tech startups pay well? That's a great question. The answer is it depends on the company.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of startups will,
And the person.
yeah, a lot of startups will pay market rate. A lot of startups will not pay market rate. It depends really on the agreement the startup comes up with. The understanding is that you value the equity more, so by definition, you're not getting that money as salary.
Yeah, I would say on average, startups probably don't pay as well as bigger companies because the equity that you get is not liquid, so you can't sell it. So the amount of like liquid money that you have at the end of the year is going to be less, probably by definition.
Do tech startups drug test?
Ooh, not in California.
Oh, I was drug tested. Are you drug tested?
Mm.
Well, I peed in a cup and everything.
I
No, I'm kidding. We were not drug tested. It depends, obviously, on the company, but we were not drug tested.
I was
here.
not drug
I don't know if
tested.
I'm supposed to tell you that. Do tech startups succeed? Like earlier, depends on your definition of success. I succeed in every endeavor because I feel great after.
It also depends on when you would say that a company has succeeded, because a startup could be around for 20 years and do really well and then die in the 21st year. Did they succeed or not?
I think people will say yes.
Yeah, they technically did for 20
I
years.
feel like the traditional answer is like 95% of startups fail. No one knows if that's true or not, but it's pretty high failure rate. Do tech startups fail? Great question. Similar answer. Yes, they do fail. I guess by definition, all startups have to fail at some point. Something can't live forever till the end of the world, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
The sun blows up, then all startups have failed. But yes, a lot of startups fail. A lot of startups don't raise any money. A lot of startups don't get product market fit. There are a lot of ways to fail and a few ways to succeed.
Maybe the founders only wanted to build a company that sold for some small amount. Some people would consider that a failure. Some people would consider it a success. Or maybe the founders just wanted to have fun and they didn't expect the company to work out, but the fun that they had was considered a success.
Why do tech startups need funding?
I think so if startups are like a step function where at every step they like increase capacity in several areas, like the complexity of the product, the problem that they're solving, they're going to need more money to take that next step, and that's to hire people, to increase advertising, to do all sorts of stuff. And in order for startups to make big bets like that, they need to have money in the bank and know that they're going to be okay, and they shouldn't just focus on profiting off their customers.
How do tech startups get funding? I feel like we answered this one,
We did.
so I'm going to skip it. You get money. How do tech startups work? I think we also answered this one.
Well, we answered how startups work, but
Well, how do tech startups
are
work?
tech startups different?
That's a good question.
Should
We
we stereotype
didn't distinguish, but we did say earlier startups are any venture. So tech startups are definition a venture where specifically technology is used to effectively sell a product or service.
How do you define technology?
I'm not going to go into that. What do tech startups need?
Money.
They definitely need money. They want product market fit. They want a product or service that solves a very urgent problem. So they need lots of things. How much do tech startups pay? So very similar to our first question, it depends on the startup. Some startups pay very well. Think of like the Airbnbs and companies that are already very, very successful. Some companies may not pay that well. But the biggest difference is a lot of times startups will pay in equity, which is very different from dollars.
The startups that don't pay well, a lot of them promise that you will be very well paid in the future. So it's just a bet that you're making.
How much do tech startups sell for? Wow. Literally the startup or the product? Well, startups can be sold for a wide variety of prices. You can think of companies that sell for billions of dollars, and there's companies that just are sold for a couple tens of thousands of dollars. I know a bunch of people who just have like side projects on the internet that people will buy for, thousands of dollars because they built something that's useful and hundreds or thousands of people are using it, versus if you create a giant enterprise that's useful for a giant company, they will usually pay more money.
To generalize, startups will sell for whatever parent company is willing to pay for them. So,
Sweet. Next one.
what does a startup CEO do?
That's a hard question.
It is a hard question. At the very least, they do what nobody else wants to do, or what nobody else is able to do, just because it falls on them and it's their priority to do so.
A CEO makes decisions. That's their kind of primary responsibility a bit. It's tech startups and startups in general. They tend to do a lot more. If they are sort of the technical CEO, or they'll maybe engineering, or if they are maybe the salesy type person, they will be getting customers. Depends. But a lot of times they tend to be the end all be all for decision making.
Yeah. It also depends on the stage of the company. What does a startup COO do? We don't have COO.
COO. I haven't had a CEO in a very long time. So just to clarify, CEO is Chief Operating Officer?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's more like, whoever's in charge of ops and people stuff.
To be really honest, I actually have no idea, but I assume they just help run the business on a daily basis.
I think the COO is mostly in charge of like the internal like people related things that the company does. What does a startup mean?
I feel like we answer this in a couple different ways. I think it literally means a venture or a group of people who are solving a problem.
What does a startup incubator do?
Ooh, that's interesting. If I think about incubators, I think of organizations whose sole purpose is to help startups kind of get off the ground. I guess the most famous one is Y Combinator, where they take a little stake in the company, and some argue in a valuable or non-valuable way they add value by giving advice, finding right people to give you advice.
An incubator basically will take in promising startups and do whatever they can to help that startup succeed in exchange for a small percentage of the company.
And there are some
Or
that
large
don't
percentage.
some of them don't even take equity, so it depends on the incubator.
Yeah. What does a startup accelerator do? So incubator is more for early stage startups. Accelerators are more for people that are either at product market fit or maybe they're close to it and they just need to accelerate growth. So the accelerator is more for later stage startups, I think, but it's a similar idea as an incubator. You go in, they help you accelerate the growth of your company. What does a startup CTO do?
Well, CTO is Chief Technology Officer. Ideally, the goal is to lead the technology organization, and that can mean a lot of things. At a small startup, they could be heavily contributing at an individual level, like building things. As the company grows, they're designing protocols, designing the architecture of the actual platform, anything that's related to the actual technology of the company.
Yeah, I'd say, yeah. If you consider like the tech organization within a company, like an organization, then they're the CEO of that. What does a startup advisor do?
I'll be honest, I don't actually know the answer to this. I go on people's LinkedIns and I see they're the advisor of like 80 different companies. Like, is that a full-time job?
Maybe that's what they do. They
just list it on LinkedIn, that's their job.
Yeah.
But I assume the job is to have already done something successfully and provide guidance to companies and people who have yet to do it.
What does a startup company need?
We'll echo it again. They need money to pay their employees. They need a product or service to either sell or build. They need everything. They need customers. They need lots of things.
I think startups have one primary concern, and that's just to survive. Because if the startup doesn't survive, then it dies. What does a startup founder do?
That literally in the name, they found things. A startup founder is someone who takes it from an idea to something that actually lives and breathes. And once that exists and other people are helping, they will do whatever it takes to make it survive and grow. And they can be any one of these people at the end of the day. They could be none of those people.
Yeah, they could check out and sell their stuff. What does a startup need?
Why are these two that separate? A startup needs whatever it needs. I don't know.
A startup needs to survive.
Yeah. Okay.
Woo! It's gonna hit.